Yep, can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. So last week we ended off with a story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, and we didn't really highlight the main gist of the story because we were concentrating on, if you remember, the end of the story of Zechariah ben Avkulus and the lessons about, taking a stand. So being that it's the 9 days, I figured that we would read a similar Gemara because there are 3 or 4 different places throughout Shas where the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash is recorded. And so I decided I'd deviate a little bit and learn the Gemara from Yuma tonight, which is very relevant. And we will see how it compares at all to any of the stories that we've saw in Gittin over the last couple of weeks. Okay, so if any of you have a Masechta Yuma handy, we are starting from Daf Tes. Daf Tes in Yuma is where the story of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash is first mentioned. And it is, if you have a Gemara, it is about 10 lines or so down from the top. Gemara says, Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rav Yochanan. My Siv, Yiras Hashem Tosif Yamim, Ushnaus Reshaim Tiktzarena. The Pasuk in Mishlei says that fearing God adds days to your life, and the years of the wicked are cut short. So we're comparing the beginning of the pasuk to the end of the pasuk. So the Gemara says, what's this referring to? Yiras Hashem Tosef Yamim Zeh Migdash Rishon. The beginning of the pasuk, which is a positive note, talks about how this is referring to the Migdash Rishon that stood for 410 years. V'lo shimshu bo ella yudches kohanim gedolim. And out of those 410 years, there were only 18 what we would call Kohen Gadol's, okay? Over 410 years. That's pretty good on the average, and the Gra in his Girsa actually has a number of 12, right? He proves it from Psukim and Divrei Hayamim. We're not going to discuss that now, but there's a machlokas of how many there were. The Gra's opinion is that there were 12 that lasted for 410 years. So that's like in the mid-30s average year per Kohen Gadol. That means that they were good at their job, right? To be on the job for 35 or so years. Ushnos Rishaim Tiktzarena Ze Migdasheni. The end of the pasuk that talks about how the days of the wicked are cut short, that's referring to the second Beis Hamikdash, Sha'ama Dal Mios Ve'esrim Shana. That stood for 420 years. The Shimshubo Yoser Mishlosh Me'os Kohanim. And when you calculate all the Kohanim, all the Kohen Gadols, there were over 300 of them. So that's already bad, right? So if you stop there, you're averaging about 1.2 a year. That means that someone's not doing their job correctly. So if you think that's bad, we're going to magnify that number and say that the truth is that there were a couple of good ones though. So now we're reducing the years from 410. We're taking out 40 that had one Kohen. His name was Shimon HaTzadik. We're going to get to him a bit later. Ushmonim Shashimesh Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and another 80, right, that Yochanan Kohen Gadol was. That's 420 minus 120, right? Eser Shashimesh Yishmael ben Pabi. Yishmael ben Pabi gets the bronze medal for 10. V'amrila Yud Aleph, some people say 11, Shashimesh. V'amrila Yud Aleph Shashimesh Rabbi Elazar ben Charsom. If you start reducing it, we're like down to 280. So basically, if you have 300 Kohen Gadol's that served for 260, 270 years, that means that you're in the decimals. You're doing 0.9 or 0.8 Kohens per year. That's very bad. Okay. That means that the average one is not even lasting a year. Okay. So they obviously couldn't be that good at all. So that's really the way the Gemara introduces the similarity or the lack of between the Beis Rishon and the Beis Sheni, and that's what this year is really about. Because I want to talk about specifically this Gemara, that it goes back and forth between what they did wrong in the first temple, what they did wrong in the second temple, and if there's anything we could actually take away from this. So the first note I wanted to bring was that of the Marsha, because the Marsha says, well, look at this pasuk that the Gemara is analyzing. It's a pasuk from Mishlei, which basically says that fearing God extends your life, but the lives of the wicked are cut short. So the Marsha says right off the bat, he says, Ratzalomar, Shanim diyamim shegnigzru la'adam kafi mazlo. Now, we had 2 years, about a year and a half ago, if you remember, on this concept of mazel, and what are you destined to, and what are you not destined to, and how much is in our hands. So he says that we are destined to a certain, right? We all have an internal shot clock, right? And we hope it's a very long one, but we do expire at the end. But he says, the Marsha says, this is all according to what you are ordained to, what our mazel dictates. But Yiras Hashem Tosef la'adam yamim. But he says that there's a way of adding overtime to our timer, which is what? He says by instilling Yiras Hashem and Yamim ala al-Hagzera. Kumoshe Matzinu b'Chezkiah. He brings a proof from King Chezkiah. He brings a pasuk v'husafti al yamecha chamesh esrei shana. Then he says v'chen behepach. The same is true the opposite way. You could lose years. B'rashaim shnoseim shenigzru lehem tiktzarna. Okay, there's ways of losing it also. So that's what we're saying over here. That what are we comparing? So what the Gemara is doing is basically comparing that the people were just generally better. When I say people, I mean the Kohanim, specifically the Kohen Gadol, were better. Therefore, they had extended, right? They had that extended warranty. They lasted much longer. They lasted, right? If you did the math, right, in the mid-30s or so, 33, 34 years per term on the average. And the second Beis Hamikdash went down from 33 years to like 0.8 years. That's a pretty big fall, obviously. So that's what one important aspect that the Gemara says. So let's look at these numbers. Now, I'm not a really big fan of gematria. I'll be honest with you. I mean, they're cute, and I can't remember in the last 2 years ever discussing any gematrias or this and that. But I just want to talk about this one, because this one stands out a little bit. This comes from a Rabbeinu Bechaya. All right, the Rabbeinu Bechaya is talking about the first pasuk of Parshas Pekudei. Okay, Parshas Pekudei usually gets swallowed up with Vayakel, but the very first pasuk of Pekudei says, "Ele Pekudei HaMishkan Mishkan Ha'edus Asher Pukad Al Pi Moshe Avodas Halavim Biyadi Tamar Ben Aharon HaKohen." That's the beginning of Pekudei, which basically, Parshas Pekudei is all about the accounting, the final accounting of the Mishkan and how many donations they got and where everything went. And Parshas Pekudei is known as the doing, right? The commands came in Vayakel, and Vayas Kasher Diber Hashem al Moshe, or Kasher Tiva Hashem es Moshe, is repeated, I think, 18 or 19 times in Parshas Pekudei. So Moshe did everything. But the Torah uses the word Hamishkan Mishkan. It says Ele Pekudei Hamishkan Mishkan. So the Rabbeinu Bechaya picks up on that, and he says V'im taskil b'milas Hamishkan Ha'edus. If you look at those 3 words in a row, Hamishkan Mishkan ha'edus. Timtza behen remez lemispar hashanim sha'amad Beis Rishon u'Bayis Sheni. You'll see a hint to how many years the first temple lasted and the second temple lasted, and the amount of years that spanned from Yetzias Mitzrayim ad shebana Shlomo es habayis. Ki hamishkan b'misparo im ha'otiyot remez l'bayis sheni. Because when you add up the word hamishkan with the letters, right? If you do hey, mem, shin, chaf, nun, you have 415. If you add up the five, which is the 5 letters right now, I don't know if there's any gematria fans out there, but when you're kind of stuck with a gematria, there's several different tricks you could use. One of them is adding a 1, subtracting a 1, but you could use sometimes the number of letters in the word. They could help out. So the word Hamishkan is 5 and 40 is 345, 365, 415. Okay? Remez labayit sheni v'chen mishkan de mispora remez labayit rishon. Right? Again, it was 410, as the Gemara said. Right? 410 for number 1 and 420 for number 2. Right? So they're close. But what separates them is the word ha-mishkan. So one of them has mishkan, which is 410. One of them has ha-mishkan, which is 415, plus you're adding 5. So that's so far 2. And then he says, the kol elu ha-cheshbonos, then he says the word edus is also 469, I believe. So therefore, you have in total 3 different gematrias. This is what Moshe saw b'Ruach HaKodesh. Now, why are we talking about Parshas Pekudei? Because obviously the predecessor for the Beis Hamikdash was the Mishkan. So that's why it says Ha-Mishkan, Mishkan, it says the word Mishkan twice. Okay, so very nice. So that's the Rabbeinu Bechaya. So if you just leave that alone, that's a cool gematria, one would say. The Chassam Sofer points out, he says, let's look at this Chassam Sofer one more time. He says Mishkan is 410, right? And the word ha'edus, right? Now, when you do the word ha'edus, you have to take the vav out, and that gives you 469. Now, what is 469? We didn't say that. 469, we're going to see this number later on. 469 is the amount of years that the Mishkan stood until the Beis Hamikdash. We're going to go over later some history, and we're going to prove that it's 469 years. He says, the Chassam Sofer says, V'hu davar nifla. He says this whole thing is what they call hafla v'fel. It's unbelievable. Now, what's unbelievable? I think his problem is, he says, why are we playing this game with a 5? Right? He says, why is it on one Edus you add 5 and the other one you don't add? I'm sorry, on one Mishkan you add 5 to bump up to 420. The other one you leave at 410. He says, Elet Shatzarach Lomer, my time a chaser him mispar Bayis Sheni. Why is it that when it comes to the Bayis Sheni that stood for 420 years, we're missing 5, right? So we need help. So we have to bump up from 415 to 420. That's not fair. Why do we need help? Why are we missing 5 from the Bayis Sheni? That we need help to go from 415 to 420. He says, ready for this? He says, because if you know, the Gemara in Yuma that we're going to see later on says that there were 5 things lacking in the Bayis Sheni. It didn't have an Aron, and it didn't have a menorah, and it didn't have a whole bunch of things that we're going to see later on. So therefore, the fact that it's missing 5.
I have a question about that.
Oh no.
It didn't have the Aron, but what about the Sefer Torah that was in the Aron?
So we're going to see that. We're going to see that.
Was that the one that Apostomus burnt?
Yeah, no. No, that was one of the things on Shivas HaB'Tammuz.
Yeah, but didn't he burn that Torah?
Right. That I don't know.
I thought I saw that.
I don't know. Do you know who ended up marrying Apostomus's wife? It's a trivia question.
Um,
Rabbi Akiva.
Wow. You sure about that?
Yeah, that's what it says in Bava Basra somewhere. Okay, not for now. Getting
Oh,
back
right,
to
after he
yes,
and Rachel broke up.
yes. He couldn't take the father-in-law. Anyways, so that's a beautiful Chassam Sofer explaining this Rabbeinu Bechaya. There happens to be, if you were wondering, a second. There's going to be a third much later on, but a second remez is the pasuk says in the beginning of Tetzaveh, V'ata tetzavet b'nei Yisrael v'koyach Hashem and Zayzach katit lamaor. The Rabbeinu Bechaya again on the word katit. What does kasis mean? Kasis means crushed, right? The mitzvah was to take the olive and to crush it to get the oil. So the word katit, kaf taf yud taf, is gematria how much? 430. What is 430? I'm sorry, 830. What's the significance of 830? Well, we know already. Zeh Hamikdash Rishon she'amad taf yud shana, Hamikdash sheni taf kuf shana, right? And that's why it's crushed. He says it's not just haphazard that the word we use for the gematria means to crush. It's a symbol that both Beis Hamikdashes unfortunately were crushed. And there you have your 830. Okay, now I want to go back to the Gemara because we left off, if you're following at home with the Yuma, 5 lines from the bottom. So we're going to read through this a little bit quickly because the Gemara goes on to say, not only are we talking about the Beis, right? Because we're talking about the Beis Rishon, Beis Sheni. 5 lines from the bottom. Rav Yochanan ben Torta. Rav Yochanan ben Torta. He had a funny name. Well, there's an interesting story how he got that name, and not for now. Mipnei machar v'Shilo. Why did Shiloh get destroyed? Now we're not going to talk about why the Beis Hamikdash got destroyed yet. The Gemara goes in historical order, in chronological order. Why was Shiloh destroyed? Right? There were 2 things going on. There was Gilu Arayos, and they were lax when it came to Kodshim, when it came to stuff pertaining to the Beis, to the Mishkan and the Mizbeach. I'll just paraphrase a little bit to get to the point. So the last 3 lines talk about the fact that Hophni and Pinchas, the sons of Eli, played around, and they weren't literally immoral. What they did was they took their time in dealing with the karbanos that the women would bring, right? Their kinehen, right? After they gave birth, a woman had to bring a karban, right? And that would permit her to go back to her husband and to eat kudshin. And they were careless when it came to servicing their karban. So therefore, they were delayed in going back to their husbands, right? So therefore, it procrastinated further potential pruruvu. So that's what the Gemara says. And then the Gemara brings another pasuk on, we're up to 9b on top, the 3rd line, that they were lax when it came to the kudshim. Okay, so now the Gemara goes back on the first wide line. So we know why Shiloh was destroyed. Okay, so let's understand why the Hamikdash Rishon was destroyed. Hamikdash Rishon mipnei charev, mipnei gimel dvarim shehayu bo, avodah zara, gil arayos, shvichas damim. Right, the 3 what we call cardinal sins, the 3 sins that a Jew has to give up their life for, right? They happen to do all those 3 sins. Terrible. And the Gemara goes, we'll just do a few of the psukim. Avodah zara dechsiv ki katzer hamatzam histareh. He says that the bed is too short, right? It's too short to be stitched up. The Gemara says, what does that mean? The bed couldn't fit 2 people. So what is that referring to? Referring to the next book, basically that they were doing avodah zarah. So God said, I can't fit fit on the same bed with your avodah zarah. You got to pick one, right? Two people, right, don't get along with each other, right, on the same bed. There's not enough room for each of them. So therefore, that's a raya from a pasuk in
Where
Yeshaya.
does the Gemara say?
I know you're going to say that about the bed is not too big enough and the bed is not too small enough. We'll say that for later. Okay, I got you there. That's one of your favorites, right? Amar of Yonasan. Okay, so we're going to go back to, so the Gemara goes on to say a couple of more lines down. Gila Arayas, again, I just want to give the long introduction. Gila Arayas, Tichsiv, Ayomer Hashem Ya'an Ki Gavohu Benos Tzion Vatilachna Netuyos Garon. It talks about how the women would walk not so tzniustic. Their neck was stretched out, and the shak was ayin. They had makeup, haloch v'tafuf telachnu raglehem techasena. The Gemara goes on to say that shahiu mahalchos arucha b'tzad kitzara. They were walking in a non-modest way. They were walking very slowly. They were making themselves basically stand out, right? They were walking broad-shouldered, and they had a lot of makeup on, and they had perfume on. Gemara goes on to say that. So that's the second pasuk. And if you skip down the 5-6 lines, shvichas damim. How do you know that they did shvichas damim? Dichsev v'gam dam naki shafach menashe harbe ma'od ad asher miles Yushalayim polapo. Right in pasuk in Malachim that says that Menashe committed a lot of murder. Period. So we already know from last week from the Daf Yomi already that the Beis Sheni was Kamsa bar Kamsa, which is Sinas Chinam, right? And we're going to see Sinas Chinam is related to Lashon Hara, right? They're related. And the Beis Rishon was for 3 really big, egregious sins. But let's ask a very fundamental question. So the first bias we did avodah zarah, gil arayos, shvichas damim, horrible things. And what did we get? We got a punishment of 70 years in Galus, right? That was our punishment. But for the Beis Sheni, which was for, let's just use the word, something of less, a lesser evil, we got sinas chinam. Our punishment is 2,000 years and counting. So one might ask, where is the equivalence in that? Right? It's a very interesting question. This is something that we should all have asked, at one point. We know that Kamsa bar Kamsa is a horrible story, and we haven't had the Beis Hamikdash since then. But they were performing Gilu Arayos, Shvichas Damim, Avodah Zarah, right? The 3 sins that, ironically, we happen to have to give our lives up for. They were doing that on a day-to-day basis. So where is the moral equivalency of those 2 punishments? So this is a very, very, basic question that needs a good answer. And thank God we have the Meshech Chachma in Parshas Beshalach to answer the question. So I'm going to read a little bit of it. He says, this is the Meshech Chachma in the beginning of Parshas Beshalach, where it says, "Vayavo b'nei Yisrael b'toch hayam v'yabasha v'ha'amayim lehem choma miminam u'mismalam." Okay, he ties it into a medrash. I'm not going to explain so much why it's bedavka on this pasuk, but he says the following: "Behizbonen b'darkei haTorah nireh ki b'mitzvos ma'isios." Let's talk about things that we do, real actions that we do. Okay, what we call ma'isa mitzvos, kigon avodah zarah, arayos, yesh karasu skila. Right? What's the punishment for something that you do, a real bad sin? So you get skila, right, for avodah zarah, for arayos, right? These are physical actions that you do, right? Umalkos, good, but loken b'nimusios, umidos. He says, what about when it comes to bad manners, right? What are some of the punishment? What are some of the Lota says for bad manners? He says machlokes, right? Having a machlokes with someone, right? The Gemara actually learns from Korach. It says v'loyek korach v'cha adato. The Gemara learns from there that it's a lav, it's a Lota set to have a machlokes with someone, not an argument, a fight, right? Lashon hara, rechilus. What about lashon hara and rechilus? Those are also negative prohibitions, right? Those are also lotas says. Gezel, okay, he lumps gezel together with this, but ein malchus. But in all of these items, there's no malchus, right? All these things that we mentioned, there's no punishment. Why? Because if you steal something, you could return it back. Oh, or you get off on a technicality because it's a lav she'ein bo ma'isa. Ulam ze dafka biyachid. So you can see the question is bothering him. What we just said a few minutes ago is, why is that? He says this, ironically, is only when it comes to a single person, ha'oseh. Avol im hatzibur nishchatin bazeh. He says, what if the whole tzibur does this? What if the whole tzibur commits one of these, what we call a nimus, right? A machlokes, or lashon hara, or rechilus. First, the whole tzibur doing avodah zarah, gilarayas, and shvichas damim. When it comes to the public, right? He says, matzanu lahepech. He says, we find just the opposite. They're punished more. And what's his proof? His proof is exactly from over here. He says, Ugdulam Mizo Amr, he brings a proof from David, not important for now, but his second proof is Ugdulam Mizo Amr Shel Hamikdash Rishon. When it comes to the Mikdash Rishon, there was about the Zara and Gila Arayas. But the Mikdash Sheni Haya Oskin the Torah mitzvos. So but Sinas Chinam, Bisham Shalu, Mihem Gedolim, the Gemara that we're going to see soon says, which people were greater, right? Later on in the Gemara in Yuma, and Daf Tes on the bottom, the question is, which one is greater? So Gemara answers, Tunu Einechem Bebira. Well, look, who got the Beis Hamikdash back? Well, the people who survived the destruction of the first one got it back. So it sounds like because the Beis Hamikdash was returned, he says that when it comes to the tzibur, they are punished worse when they act badly more than if they act in doing a lotaseh such as gilarai shvichas damim and avodah zarah. That's an unbelievable chiddush. It's counterintuitive. Yes, you learn. Right, you learn the mitzvos and you see that you get skila for certain things, but not for other things. But the whole point is that when it comes to the tzibur, this is a proof that we actually get the tzibur carries a greater punishment when it's what the Meshech Chochmah calls nimusios, not real sins, just sins the way you act toward your fellow man that don't usually get you malchus and skila. So I thought that was a great way to explain why is it that the first bias was why it came back for them, because it wasn't related to nimus, to how you conduct yourself between people. So let's for a minute let's learn some history, something we don't do a lot over here in the class. So we're going to look at a Rambam. The Rambam discusses a little bit about history when he starts off his book. It's called Hilchas Beis HaBechira, right? One of the Yad HaChazaka, one of the 14 books. One of the subsections is Laws of the Beis HaMikdash. And right in the beginning of the first chapter, the fourth halacha, he says, Binyan Shabana Shlomo, Kvar Mefurish B'Malachim. He says, and just an introduction to this, we know that we had the Mishkan from year 2, okay, up until the Beis Hamikdash. So the Jews had it in the desert for 39 years. And then we had it for, if you remember, 369 years in Shiloh. So if you add 39 and 369, right, you're around 410 or so. Then you add Nov and Givon. And if you add up all of the years, it ends up being 4, right? Remember what the Rebbeinu Bachaya said, the gematria of the word edus, right? Without the vav is 469. There you have the years of the Mishkan. And then you have the Beis Hamikdash Rishon, which was built right after that. which was 800 and which was, I'm sorry, 480 years, right? The pasuk in Malachim, if you remember, Malachim Aleph, I think the beginning of Parak Ches says 480 years after Yetzias Mitzrayim is when Shlomo built the Beis Hamikdash. That's how Malachim Aleph Parak Ches, I think, starts. It lasted 410 years. It was built by Shlomo, as we said, and it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, then we were kicked out, 70 years, we were exiled. We were in Bavel, we had Ezra and Nehemiah, and toward the end, we were brought back. That 70 years, by the way, was when the whole Purim story happened. Okay, we're going to talk about Purim a little bit later on. And then after 70 years, we went back and under the permission of the Persian king of Koresh, who actually let us build the Beis Hamikdash again, we enjoyed it for 420 years, only to be destroyed by the Romans, right? As we saw in the Daf Yomi a couple of weeks ago with Titus, right? So the Rambam says, Binyan Shabana Shlomo Kvar Mefurash B'Malachim, Uchen Binyan Ha'asli Banos. So let's hold on a second. So the first Beis Hamikdash, if you want to know how it was built, look in Navi, look in Malachim Aleph. That's easy, right? If you want to know how the third Beis Hamikdash is going to be, right? Kasavhu b'Yechezkel. He says it's mentioned in the book of Yechezkel, but it's not so explicit. What he's referring to is the Gemara in Menachos, I believe, Daf Mem Daled Mem Hey, talk about all these contradictions written in the 45th chapter of Yechezkel that don't really jive with the Torah's description of Karbanos, and a lot of Mefarshim explain that it's referring to the third Beis Hamikdash. But the Rambam does admit that it's not so clear. So he talks about the first Beis Hamikdash, he talks about the third Beis Hamikdash. The second one, he says that was built in the days of Ezra. So the Rambam uses the word Banuhu Kibinyan Shlomo. They built it similar to the structure of Shlomo, Ume'ein Dvarim HaMefurashin b'Yechezkel. And they included certain aspects which are written in the book of Yechezkel. So we see that there was some kind of hybrid building that wasn't exactly the third Beis Hamikdash, wasn't exactly the first Beis Hamikdash. It was something in between. So the first Beis Hamikdash is very simple to understand because that obviously had the most kedusha. First of all, it was built, and at that time, Yerushalayim wasn't ruled. It was Shlomo HaMelech, and after he died, the next king and the next king, it was all under the reign of kings that were in the land of Israel, what we call Malchus Beis David, right? It had the Aron, it had everything, right? The Nevi'im, I believe Yeshaya, Yirmiyahu, right? All of those Nevi'im were around during the first temple. The Beis Sheni, though, was much different because it was ruled actually by many different kingdoms. In fact, there's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah. I'll read it on Daf Tes. Avodah Zarah Daf Tes is a very famous daf. It talks about figuring out what year you are in the Shemitah cycle based on the age of the world and based on the Chorban Habayis. It's a very controversial daf. But on top of it, on top of the daf, on Daf Tes Amud Aleph, it says that the 420 years of the Beis Migdash Sheni, it says Malchus Paras were there for 34 years, right? Before Malchus Paras B'fnei Habayis Shloshim V'Arba Shana, the Persian Empire, right, which again, that was the extension of Achashverosh, because if you remember at the end of Achashverosh, he was the one who made the mistake of Etacheshbin, not for now, and the Jews started to build toward the end, right? So the Persian Empire ruled 34 years before the Beis Hamikdash and after the Beis Hamikdash, and then came Malchus Yavan. Malchus Yavan, the Greeks ruled for 180 years. Then the Chashmonaim B'fnei Habayis Me'ah V'Shalosh. Then you had 103 years of the Hashmonaim, and of course you had the story of Hanukkah happen after that, right? Malchus Beis Hordus Mea B'Shalosh. Then you had 103 years of the kingdom of Hordus. And if you remember, the Gemara in Bava Basra talks about how they did a lot of shiputzim to the Beis Hamikdash in those years at Hordus, right? He added stones and he did all kinds of nice stonework, and he built up a lot of the Beis Hamikdash. And then that was the end of that. So you see that obviously there was less kedusha, there was less going on, and there was more tumult, so to speak, because the people were not united. They were in the hands of different rulers, right? So very, very different periods between the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash. Now, before we mentioned that in that gematria of adding 5 and taking away 5, if you remember that. So here's the Gemara that shows that this Beis Hamikdash Sheni, it's funny, I heard that the Abarbanel, when he describes the Beis Sheni, he actually called it a beautiful synagogue, meaning it didn't have the kedusha. Like if you would look at it, yeah, on the outside it looks like a Beis Hamikdash, but when you delve into the differences and see what's really going on, it completely lost its kedusha after the Churban of the first one. That's why he actually calls it a beautiful place to worship. He doesn't use the word Beis Hamikdash. One of the reasons is, let's see the Gemara over here. It says, Aman Yuma Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, which is the last daf of the first parak of Yuma. It says, it brings a pasuk. It's the word Ve'eratzebo v'ikabda. The word v'ikabda is not written with a hey. And the Gemara says, Elu chamisha dvarim shahayu beis hamikdash rishon u'mikdash sheni. There were 5 different things that weren't there in the Beis Sheni and the Beis Sheni ve'elohen: Aron, Kapores, Kruvim, Eish, Ushchina, V'ruach HaKodesh, V'urim V'tumim. Now that's more than 5, but Aron and Kapores and Kruvim, I believe, are counted as 1. Now, to your question before, it does not count the Torah per se. It counts the Aron, the Kapores, which is the top piece, the cover, and the Kruvim, that's 1. Eish, Shchina, Ruach HaKodesh, and Urim V'tumim. So you see, the biggest word over the biggest difference is Shechina. There was no Shechina. How do you have a Beis Hamikdash without Shechina? What's the purpose of it? So you see that there's this drastic fall, like this drastic diminishment of kedusha between the first Beis Hamikdash and the second one. So even though, and this is what the Gemara in Yuma said before earlier, that even though we did these 3 major sins, what is the difference? The difference is that it didn't affect the leadership of the kahuna, right? How do we start this whole thing off by saying? By saying that they did sin, they did the big 3, they did the 3 cardinal sins, but you know what? They got along. The Kohanim didn't get into trouble. What was the problem with the Beis with the Beis Sheni? The Beis Sheni, no Kohen lasted. You know why they didn't last? Because it was full of corruption. In fact, the Gemara, we skipped it. There was a bach that we missed in the beginning where it talks about that you could buy the kahuna, right? It went to the highest bidder. How do you have a Beis Hamikdash where the whole point of the Kohen, right, was to do the temple service? He was in charge. If it doesn't run properly, if the whole system is corrupt, then how does this whole thing work? That's why no Kohen lasted a year, because they were all killed out, because no one was right, no one was just. In fact, the biggest proof that we had these corrupt Kohanim is a story all the way at the end of Menachos. the Gemara at the end of Menachos talks about this concept of Beis Chanyo. I don't know how well you remember from 2019 when we did this at the end by the Daf Yomi cycle. When we learned Menachos, there was a story. I'm going to read an excerpt from a story about Shimon HaTzadik. Okay, it talks about right now. Shimon HaTzadik was the one who the Gemara just mentioned that we earlier. That was the Kohen Gadol for 40 years. So when he during the Bayis Sheni. So right before he died, the Gemara says, "B'shas p'tiraso amar lahem Chonyo b'ni Yishamesh tachti." So Chonyo had two sons. Now the way it worked is the Kohen Gadol, if he died, so assuming his sons were, decent, they would become the Kohen Gadol. Okay, so he had two sons. So he decided to give it to his son who was younger. He gave it to his younger son. Amar lahem Chonyo b'ni Yishamesh tachti. He said to the Chachamim that my son Choni is going to serve as the Kohen Gadol. So Niskana bo Shimi Achiv. So he had another son named Shimi. Shimi Shahaya Gadol Meno Shtayim Shanim Umachta. Shimi was 2.5 years older than his younger brother Chonya. So obviously he wasn't too happy. So he devised a plan to get back at him. Amar lo. So he told his younger brother, Bova alemet chaseder havoda. He says, I'm going to teach you now how to be the Kohen Gadol. This is how you do the avoda. And what he did was, hilbisho be'unkuli v'chagru betziltzol. What he did was he took his wife's clothing, his wife's tunic, and put a ribbon on it, and dressed him up like a woman. And he said, this is what you have to wear to the Beis Hamikdash. Himidu etzel hamizbeach. And there he was, the first day, opening day, that's what he wore when he went to the Mizbeach. Can you imagine that? Amar lahem la'echav ha'kohanim. So Shimi, right, said to the Kohanim, look at this man. Look at my brother. He doesn't know what he's doing. Re'u manadar zeh. V'kiyam lo ohavaso. He says, look, he had to make his wife happy, right? So he decided so she agreed that she'll give him his clothing for the first day, and that's what he's going to wear to the Beis Hamikdash just to make his wife happy. Now, as we discussed many times in class, there is a big inyan in making your wife happy, but not at the expense of a Kohen Gadol serving in the Beis Hamikdash like this. So therefore, everyone got upset, right? So also hayom sheishtamish bekahuna gedula elbosh beunkuli, right? He says, look at what this man did. He decided to wear women's clothing, right? Ve'achkor betziltzi, right? He said, I'm going to be the Kohen Gadol, and I'm going to wear it. So big shoechav kohanim lahargo. So when they saw what was going on, all the kohanim got together and they said, we're going to kill you. So ratz mipnehem. So Chunyo ran away. He ran out of the Beis Hamikdash, and he ran so far, he ended up, right? This is a little reminiscent of Forrest Gump. He ran and he made it all the way. Halach Alexandria Shal Mitzrayim. He sprinted all the way to Alexandria in Egypt. And he probably wasn't too happy because his brother set him up for failure. And he said, in his revenge, Ubana Sham Mizbeach, and he built a Mizbeach, V'hel alav l'shum avodas kochavim. And the Gemara actually says, we're not going to get into the whole story, but he built a Beis Hamikdash in Egypt. This is the other Beis Hamikdash that no one knows about. He built a duplicate of the Beis Hamikdash in Egypt, and it's a machlokes what the intent was, but this Manda Amar, this Rab Meir is the opinion. He says that he built it with Shum Vodas Kochavim, and that was the end of that. Why we bring this whole story? To teach you how corrupt the system was in the second Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so obviously we see this major difference, right, of this kedusha that although they sinned, granted, but and we quoted this a long time ago from Maseches Derech Eretz, that as long as everyone's on the same page and there's no corruption and then people are acting properly amongst themselves, right? It doesn't matter. They all could be serving avodah zarah, right? That's what the Mishnah at the end of Maseches Derech Eretz says. So we already noted that there are two hints lasting, right? That the Beis Rishon lasted 410 years. A third gematria, right, that we're going to have is the famous pasuk says Bezos Yavo Aharon Al Kodesh, the beginning of Parshas Achrei Mos. It says Bezos, right? This is how.
Isn't that like the Dora Flaga is better than the Dora Mabel because at least they got along, even though they did
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's what it says in Maseches Derech Eretz. I think it's the same. And the last parak, it's called Parak HaShalom. There's a whole parak. We mentioned this about a year and a half ago. There's a whole parak. It's not a well-learned Masechta because it's one of those Masechtas Katanas found all the way at the end of, I think, Avodah Zarah. But it talks about how Gadol HaShalom. It says pieces. Right? You could never, ever underestimate how the power of shalom. It says, even if everyone is sinning, as long as they're sinning together, right? So it goes to show you, and this is exactly the point when during the Bayis Sheni, when there was sinas chinam and you could buy the kahuna, and it's not just that the Kohen Gadol couldn't serve properly and do the karbanos. The Kohen Gadol was a very important figure. He was a political figure also. He would assess taxes, and he was like the mayor, right? I mean, we can't understand this today. We just think, oh, the Kohen Gadol, he could bring a carbon whenever he wanted. He got free barbecue, right? No. He was really, really much more of just a religious figure. He was a political figure, and when you can buy political, power, a little bit like today, you see the consequences. So anyway, getting back to the gematria is what's Bezos? The gematria of Bezos is 410. So this is not my gematria. The Baal HaTurim, right? The Baal HaTurim became famous, right? You know the story of the Baal HaTurim. The crux of his interpretations of the Torah are based on gematrias, and he says that this is referring to the 410 years. But what about the 420 years of the Bayis Sheni? What about that? So it seems like that's not important enough because it was really the Bayis Rishon that was important. The Bayis Sheni wasn't as great. And getting back to that Gemara in Yuma, just to end off, there is, if you have it in front of you, there's actually a debate which temple, was it the Rishon or the Sheni, that was holier. So if you're in the Gemara Yuma, Daf Tes Amud Beis, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth line or so, the fifth wide line, Amar Rab Yochanan, Tovat Tzipornam shel Rishonim, Mikreso shel Achronim. Rabbi Yochanan says, if you're comparing the first bias and the second bias, the fingernail of the first was greater than the belly of the second, which is a nice way of saying that basically that, the first was much more, had much more Kedusha, right? Even their nail was holier than their bodies. Reish Lakish says, no, Adrab Achronim Adifi, right? The Reish Lakish says exactly the opposite. The Bayis Sheni was better. Afagav deika shibud malchios ka'aski b'Torah, right? It says that they were osik b'Torah, right? No amalei bira tochiach shechazro l'rishonim v'lo chazro la'acharonim. Rav Yochanan says, no. You know what the proof is? The proof that the first bias, the people were much better, is because, and this is what we mentioned earlier, the Rabbeinu Bachaya mentioned it, that they got it back. That's the biggest proof you need, right? Therefore, they got a second chance. So that's pretty much all you have to say about that. Just to end off in the last 10 minutes, being that it is Gittin, I want to read just a line from our daf of a couple of weeks ago. It's daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. It's one line. The Gemara is very interesting. If it's a little bit hard to follow because the Gemara on Nun Hey Amud Beis right? I'm sorry, Nun Dalet Amud, no, I was right. Nun Hey Amud Beis on the bottom is the whole beginning of the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story. So remember how it started? Rav Yochanan says, "My dechsiv Ashrei Adam Mefachet Tamid," right? Umaksha Libo Yipol Bara. He says, "Akamsa Bar Kamsa Charav Yerushalayim," right? And then on Nun Vav, to recap the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story, it basically says that because of Rav Yochanan, because of Rav Zechariah ben Avkulus, right, everything was destroyed. Then the Gemara all the way on Daf Nun Zayin on 57b, it brings down 5 or 6 just terrible stories about Beitar and about this city got destroyed and that city got destroyed. And all the way in the middle of the wide lines, like on Nun Zayin, it's 57b, about 10 lines into the wide lines. At the end, it says, "V'hainu da'amar Rabbi Elazar." And now it's like a recap. Now that we've had all these stories, right, that Kamsa Bar Kamsa was Lashon Hara, right? See, that's what the real question is. Is this combination between, right? We just interject Lashon Hara with Sinas Chinam, right? The story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa was more Lashon Hara. Well, obviously with Sinas Chinam, but it ended up with Lashon Hara because Bar Kamsa was malshin on the Jewish people, and they couldn't bring the korban, right? And then that's how the whole thing started, and then it was destroyed because they didn't take the korban from the king. So, but the Gemara over here says that now that you heard all this story, that's what this pasuk in Iyov, the pasuk says. It says, "Hainu d'chsev nasatzi." I'm sorry. Pasuk says, "V'hainu damar Elazar b'shot lashon techabeh," right? Which basically says that the hitting, the action of through the hitting of the tongue, we hide. B'cherchure lashon techabeh, right? When you hit the tongue, right, we hide. The tongue is obviously referring to our mouth, to the way we speak, right? And that's what the Gemara ends off by saying. That's after all these stories, right? The story of Lashon Hara, of the bias, right, being destroyed. That's kind of a recap. So we see Rashi calls it Lashon Hara, but before we called it Sinas Chinam. So the Chafetz Chaim wrote actually a whole book on this. Shmiras HaLashon, and the point of the Chafetz Chaim is that one leads into the next. When you have Sinas Chinam, right? What does it lead to? It leads to Lashon Hara. That's why the Gemara goes back and forth between Lashon Hara and Sinas Chinam. There is a incredible Hassam Sofer. On the Medrash, there's a Medrash, believe it or not, this is a Chasam Sofer that's going to give you goosebumps. He says there's in Tehillim, Perek Chav Beis, it's Lamatzeach Aliyah Tashachar. There's a lot of symbolism to Purim. So the pasuk says, Yochlu Anavim V'Yisbahu. The pasuk in Tehillim 22 says that the people will eat and be satisfied. So this is actually a Yalkut Shimoni. Yalkut Shimoni says, Yochlu Anavim V'Yisbahu Zeh Mordechai ve'Esther. Right? Mordechai and Esther will eat and be satisfied. Tana L'shlosha Chalakim Nechlak Mamono Shel Haman. The Medrash says that at the end of the day, after Haman was hanged, so the pasuk talks about Achashverosh, right? That Mordechai basically inherited all of the possessions of Haman. But the truth is, there was divided into 3 parts, right? It's like estate planning, right? What happens after you die? So a third went, right? Shlish Mordechai ve'Esther, Shlish Amalei Torah. A third went to support the Kolel. Third went to Mordechai and Esther. And what about the last third? Ushlish labinyan Beis Hamikdash. And the third went, after all, I mean, let's think about it, right? We mentioned this before, right? Toward the end of Galus Bavel is when they got the go-ahead, right, from Koresh, right, to build the son of, I think he was a son of Esther. He gave the Jews the go-ahead to build the Beis Hamikdash, right? Where do they finance it from? So believe it or not, the Medrash says that it was financed from the money that Haman gave to Mordechai. All of the possessions of Haman was split, and a third went to Mordechai and Esther personally, and a third went directly to pay for the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, that is fact number one, according to the Medrash. Fact number two, look at the Gemara in Megillah, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis. The Megillah, the second parak of Megillah discusses all the words of the Megillah, right? And it gives you a drasha on, it says, Yeshno Am Echad, a very famous pasuk. In Megillah Esther says, Yeshno Am Echad, Mefuzar, Meford, Meyehudim. What is Haman doing? Haman is telling Achashverosh, look at these people. They're these downtrodden people. They're scattered all, and they're dispersed all over the world in different provinces, and their laws are different, right? Then they don't listen to the king's laws. They do whatever they want. So therefore, you really shouldn't tolerate them, says Haman to Achashverosh. So Amar Rava says a famous statement, Leika diyada lishna bishaka Haman. Haman won the gold medal when it comes to Lashon Hara. He was, right, Mr. Propaganda, right? Amar leita nechlinhu, right? He said to Achashverosh, let's destroy them. Amar le Achashverosh says, Mistafinim Elohai, I'm afraid of their God. Lo lavid keda'avid b'kamai. I'm afraid of their God, right? Because Achashverosh knew about what happened to the people who stood before him. So, okay, so Haman goes through this, Haman goes through that. But the point is that Rava says that what Haman's plan initially was to get the Jews to fall by him spreading Lashon Hara to Achashverosh, right? So if this whole thing was about Lashon Hara, right? So Haman, right, ended up hanged, right? He lost all his money. Why did he lose all his money? Because he started his whole attack through Lashon Hara. And now let's follow the dots, right? So let's connect the dots. Where did the money go? The money went to build the Beis Hamikdash. Fast forward 400 years, the Jews started speaking Lashon Hara. So it went from Haman speaking Lashon Hara, that financed the Beis Hamikdash, and after 400 years, the Jews themselves, who were saved by Lashon Hara, by getting the money, used that to build the Beis Hamikdash, and that exact money that they got to build the Beis Hamikdash ended up, they destroyed it with their own tongues. The Jews fell prey to what got them there, and they started speaking Lashon Hara, right? So this is exactly the Sinas Chinam says, and the Lashon Hara that, so the Chassam Sofer, what he does is he says, isn't it amazing that that's how strong Lashon Hara was? It could build you up, and it was exactly what took the Jews down, right? They profited from Lashon Hara to get the money, and it ended up blowing up. So that is a very beautiful, way to explain. Wow, 9 o'clock on the nose. Okay, so that's a beautiful Chassam Sofer, and obviously, and we don't have to explain what we learned from here, but we see, right? Because the Gemara itself says that, they, in the first Beis Hamikdash, they did everything right, but they just had these sins. And, the second one, though, which was much worse, right? You would never, ever think that avoiding Avodah Zarah, Gilarais, and Shvichas Damim, but just not getting along could actually destroy everything. And unfortunately, with all these stories that we see from Gittin and from Yuma, that was exactly our downfall. So goes to show you the power of Sinas Chinam. And on that note,